attribute, so we can select this element in our JavaScript. So in the opening tag, we'll type space class equals double quotes js dash score. Now that we have a class, let's get this element in our JavaScript. So let's just do it down here. So we'll type document dot query selector brackets and a string, and then we're going to type a dot, and we're going to select the class js dash score. So js dash score. So this will get the paragraph element from above and put it inside our JavaScript. And now let's put the score inside the element. To do that, we can use inner HTML. Dot inner capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the score. If we scroll down, we actually create the score down here. So we can actually just copy this string. So we'll select it, right click, copy, and let's scroll up to here. And I'll actually put this on a separate line to make it easier to read. And now here, we're going to type a string using backticks. And inside the string, we're going to right click and paste. So this will put the score that we used to have in our pop-up inside this element. So inside this paragraph. If we save and then go back to our tab, you can see that now it displays the score on the page. Now, before we move on, I want to point something out with HTML. So remember that our reset score button was beside our other buttons, and now it's below them. So what determines if an element appears beside something or below something? So the paragraph element here is known as a block element. A block element will always take up an entire line by itself. So this line already has some buttons, so the paragraph will take up the entire line under the buttons. That's why this text appears under the buttons and not beside them. And also, because a block element like this paragraph takes up this entire line, the next button has to appear below it. So that's why we get this layout here. So this is just a short review of layouts. If you want to learn this in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. All right, the next feature we're going to do is if we play the game, we also want to update the score. Right now, if we play, it doesn't update it on the page. Let's fix this in our JavaScript. So let's go down to where we update the score. So we'll scroll down, which is right here. We update the score and save it in local storage. And after we do this, we're also going to update the score on the page. So we can actually use the same code that we used above, which is here. So let's make a copy of this code, right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And I'll add a tab at the front. If we save and then try out our game, we'll click a move, press OK, and now you'll notice the score also updates on the page. So let's go back into our code and do some cleanup. So you notice that this code is the same as the code we had above. And this is a great situation to use a function to reuse this code. So at the bottom here, let's create a function using function, and we'll call it update score element, brackets and curly brackets, and we'll move this code into the function. So we'll select it, right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. And now instead of writing this code multiple times, we're just going to call the function update score element and brackets. This will run all the code inside the function, so it does the same thing as before, except we can reuse the code. So let's scroll back up. And instead of typing out all this code again, we can just use our function update score element and brackets. Now let's save. It will display the score on the page at the start. And when we click a move and click OK, it will update the score on the page. So the last feature we're going to do in relation to the score is when we click the reset score button, we also want to update the score on the page. Right now, if we click it, it doesn't actually update it. So let's go into our code and let's go to the reset button, which is here. And after we reset the score, we're going to call that function again. Update score element and brackets. If we save, and now let's play the game and press OK. So we have a score, and if we click reset score, it will reset everything back to 0. So now we finished the score. Let's go back to Super Simple Dev and play the game. And now we're going to work on this section. We're going to show the result and the moves that we picked on the page. So first, let's create some paragraphs for these as well. We'll go to our HTML, and above the score, let's add a less than p greater than. This is going to be the result. So let's give it a class of js-result. And let's create another paragraph, less than p greater than. And we'll give this one a class equals js-moves. Now let's use the DOM to put the result and the moves in these paragraphs. Feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself first. So let's scroll down to where we display the result, which is here. So we display it in a pop-up. And instead of a pop-up, we're going to get the paragraph and put this result inside the paragraph. So we'll type document.query selector, brackets, and a string, and we'll type a dot and select the class js-result, and then dot inner capital HTML, and we'll change this to result. And now let's also display the moves. So we'll type some new lines and document.query selector again, brackets and a string, dot js-moves, dot inner capital HTML, and make it equal to this text right here. So let's type a template string because we're going to insert our moves inside the string, and we'll type U, and we'll insert the player move, dollar curly brackets, player move, and then a dash, and then the computer's move. So dollar curly brackets again, and computer move, computer at the end. So now that we're displaying everything on the page, we don't need this pop-up at the end. So we can actually delete this pop-up. All right, now let's save and go back to our tab and play our game. Now it will show the result and the moves that we picked on the page instead of in a pop-up. Let's play it again to make sure it works. And finally, when we click reset score, it will reset everything back to 0. And that's it. Now we're displaying everything on the web page using the DOM. Now let's move on to the third and final project. We'll go back to supersimple.dev and we'll click back to go back to our projects. And we're going to create this third project here, which is an Amazon shipping calculator. The way this works is that inside this text box, we're going to type the cost of an order in dollars. If the order is under $40, for example, $25, and we click calculate, it will add $10 of shipping and display the total down here. But if we type a cost that is over $40, like 50, and press calculate, it will be free shipping. So it will display the same total down here. So let's learn how to create this using the DOM. Let's go back to our 09 DOM projects file, and we'll start by creating the HTML elements. So under our subscribe button, let's create this paragraph using less than p greater than Amazon shipping calculator. And next, let's create this text box. So the HTML element for a text box is called input. So we'll type less than input greater than. So the input element is special because it doesn't require a closing tag. This is called a void element. And lastly, let's create the button. So here, we'll create less than button greater than calculate. Now let's save and open the tab for this file, which is right here. And we have the text box, and the button that we need. Now, one other thing we're going to add is that in the final project, if we don't have anything in the text box, we're going to have this gray text. So this is called a placeholder. To add a placeholder to a text box, we're going to use the placeholder attribute. So inside our input element, we're going to type space placeholder equals double quotes. And inside the quotes, we'll put the text we want as the placeholder, which is cost of order, and save. Now, if we go back to our project, we now have a placeholder in our text box that disappears when we start typing. So that's all the HTML that we need. Now let's work on the JavaScript. And again, we'll figure out what steps we need to do. So when we click this button, we're going to get the text inside the text box. If the amount is below $40, we'll add $10 of shipping, and then we'll display the total on the page. Let's convert these steps into code. So we'll go to our button and add an onClick attribute. And inside here, let's also create a function to separate our JavaScript code like we did before. So in the script, we're going to create a function, and let's name it calculate total, brackets and curly brackets. And inside onClick, we're just going to call the function. So calculate total, brackets. The next step is to get the text inside the text box. So first, let's get this input element and put it inside our JavaScript. To do that, we can use document.querySelector again. So we'll add a class to this input so we can select it. Class equals js-cost-input. And then inside our JavaScript, we'll use document.querySelector query selector brackets and a string and a dot and this class js-cost-input. So this code will get the input element and put it inside our JavaScript. Let's confirm by console.logging the result and save. And now when we click the calculate button, it will give us the input element from the page. Let's save this input element in a variable so we can use it later. Instead of console.log, we'll use const and we'll name the variable input element and make it equal to this element and remove the extra bracket. And next, we need to get the text inside the input element. So far in this lesson, we've been using the property inner HTML to do this. However, for input elements, you'll notice that there is no HTML inside. So for input elements, we're going to use a different property called value. So at the bottom here, we're going to type input element dot value. This is how we get the text inside a text box. So let's console.log this to confirm that it works. So we'll console.log and save. And now let's type something in the text box like 50 and click calculate. And input.value will give us the text inside the text box. Let's save this text in a variable so we can use it later. Const, and we'll name the variable cost and make it equal to the text in the text box. The next step is to check if this cost is under $40. If it is, we'll add $10. So down here, let's type if brackets and curly brackets. And inside the condition, we'll check if cost is less than 40. And if it is, inside the curly brackets, we'll do cost equals itself plus $10 of shipping. And remember, when we change a variable, we have to switch from const to let. And finally, we're going to display the total cost on the page. So let's create a paragraph where we can display the cost. So down here, we'll create a paragraph less than p greater than. Let's give it a class js-total-cost. And now inside our JavaScript, let's use document.query selector brackets and string, and we'll type a dot and the class js-total-cost. And we're going to put the cost inside the paragraph. We can use dot inner capital HTML and make it equal. And let's use a template string. So backticks, and we'll have a dollar. And we're going to insert the cost using dollar and curly brackets cost. Now let's save and try out this project. So first, we'll type a cost that is over $40, like 50. If we press calculate, we're not going to add $10 of shipping and we'll display the same total on the page. Now let's try a number under $40, like 25, and press calculate. And this number doesn't look right. It's saying that we have to pay $2,510. So what's going on here? Let's go into our code and let's use console.log to figure out what's wrong. So first, let's console.log the cost to make sure that we're getting the right number from the text box. So down here, console.log the cost and save. And then let's type 25 again and press calculate. And it will give us 25. So we're getting the correct text from the text box. Now let's console.log down here to see if the math is working. So we'll type console.log cost and save. And let's try 25 again and calculate. And down here, when we add 10, this is where things go wrong. And it results in 2,510. So it's not doing math properly here. So let's check if cost is a number to make sure that it's doing math. So here, we'll type console.log the type of cost and save. Let's type 25 again and calculate, and aha, it's telling us that the cost is a string. So this is actually not a number, it is a string. That's why it's not doing math. So remember from the strings lesson, when we add a string with a number, JavaScript will automatically convert this number into a string and combine them together. That's why it just combines 25 and 10 here. This is called type coercion. So whenever we get a value from the DOM like this, the value will be a string. So in order to do math, we have to manually convert this string into a number. To do that, JavaScript has a built-in function called number. So before this code, we're going to type capital N number, open bracket, and close bracket. So the number function takes whatever's between the brackets and manually converts it into a number. So now if we save and we type 25 and press calculate, the cost is now a number and it will do the math properly and give us 35. So remember, whenever we get a value from the DOM, the value will be a string. So if we want to do math with it, we have to manually convert this value into a number first. So now let's remove the console.logs that we used to figure out this problem. And save. Okay, we're going to add one more feature to this project. Let's go back to supersimple.dev, and inside the text box, we're going to type 25 and press enter. So pressing enter will also calculate the total and display it on the page. So let's learn how to create this feature. So if we go back to our code, so far in this course, we've been using the attribute onClick, which runs some JavaScript when we click an element. HTML has another attribute we can use called onKeyDown, which runs JavaScript when we press a key down on our keyboard. So inside the input this time, let's add the attribute onKeyDown equals double quotes, and then inside here, console.log and the string typing. So now, every time we type in the input, it will console.log this message. Let's save it and give it a try. We'll go to the tab for this file, and then inside the text box, we'll type some numbers. And you can see that every time we type something, it will run this code and display this message. So that's how we do something when we type in an element. So clicks and keydowns are known as events. OnClick and onKeyDown are known as event listeners. They check for events and runs JavaScript when those events happen. Now, in addition to clicks and keydowns, there are many other events we can listen for in JavaScript. Okay, so now let's figure out what steps we need to do for this project. When we press a key down in the text box, we're going to check if the key is the Enter key. If it is, we'll do the same thing as the Calculate button. So how do we know what key we pressed? Inside onKeyDown, we're actually given a special object called event. So instead of this string, let's remove it and we'll console.log event. So this is an object that's provided to us by JavaScript, and it contains information about the event. Every event listener, including onClick, also gets an event object. If we save and type in this text box, it will show us that event is this object. And inside the object, it has a bunch of information, including the key that we typed. So here, let's use the event object and we'll get .key and save. So now inside this text box, if we type something, it will tell us the key that we pressed. And if we press enter, it will tell us that the key is enter. So the next step is to check if the key is enter. And we can do that using an if statement. So in our code, we'll type a new line, if brackets and curly brackets, and inside the condition, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string enter. If it is equal to enter, we're going to do the same thing as the calculate button. So we can actually just use this function again. Inside the curly brackets, we'll type calculate total and brackets and save. So now let's go back to our project and type 25 enter, and it will calculate the total and display it on the page. So that's how we create this keyboard feature of this project. Lastly, let's clean up our code and move this into a function like the rest of our code. So inside the script element, let's create a new function using function, and we'll name it handle cost key down brackets and curly brackets. And let's move this code into the function. We'll select it, right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. If we need to fix the formatting, we can select these lines and press tab. And let's remove this console.log. And now up here, we're going to call this function handle cost key down and brackets. Now, the last thing we have to do is that event does not exist inside this function. So we have to put the event object into the function. And remember, to put a value into a function, we can use a parameter. So between these brackets, we can create a parameter called event. And now to save something inside this parameter, we're going to go up to these brackets and type event. This will take the event object and put it inside the function, where we can use it just like a variable. So now if we save and try out the project, 25 enter, so this still works. And now we've finished all three projects in this lesson. So in the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn some more details about JavaScript. In the last project, we learned how to manually convert a string into a number using the number function. We can also convert the other way, from a number to a string. So let's go to the top of the script element, and we can type capital S string and brackets. So the built-in string function will convert a value into a string. Between the brackets, we can put a number like 25, and this will convert the number into the string 25. The next detail we're going to learn is a special behavior of strings. So below this line, we can type console.log the string 25 minus 5. So if a string only contains a number and we subtract, multiply, or divide, JavaScript will automatically convert this string into a number. So this gets converted into the number 25 minus 5. And if we save, it will do math and give us 20. So this is another example of type coercion or automatic type conversion. However, it's not recommended to do math with strings like this because adding works differently. For example, on a new line, let's type console.log the string 25 plus 5 and save. This will convert the number into a string and combine them together into 255. So because adding strings works differently, the best practice is always do math using numbers. Don't do math using strings. If we need to, we can manually convert the string into a number using the number function, like we did here. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is another built-in object called the window object. So in this lesson, we learned about the document object. The document object represents the web page. The window object represents the browser. So let's go into our script element and try it out. Below this, we'll type window. So this is the window object, and it represents the browser. Because it represents the browser, everything inside the browser is inside the window object. So let's think, what's inside the browser? Well, the web page is inside the browser. So the document object is inside the window object. If we type window.document, this will give us the same document object that we've been using in this lesson. So what else is part of the browser? Well, the console is also part of the browser. So here, if we type window.console, this will give us the same console object we've been using in this course. So we can actually do console.log and the string window and save. And this will do the same thing as console.log. What else is part of the browser? Well, pop-ups are also part of the browser. So if we type window.alert, this will give us the same alert function that we've been using in this course to create pop-ups. However, you might have noticed that we never type window.document or window.console.log. And that's because the window object has a shortcut. We don't have to type window dot at the front. We can just type document or console, and JavaScript will automatically add window dot at the front for us. So window is a built-in object that represents the browser. We don't have to type out window dot ourselves because JavaScript adds it for us automatically, but it's still nice to know how this works behind the scenes. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned about the document object model, or the DOM, which allows JavaScript to fully control the web page. We learned how to use document.querySelector to get elements from the web page and put them inside our JavaScript. We learned how to use inner HTML to modify the HTML inside an element. We worked on 3 projects using the DOM. We learned how to make elements interactive with the keyboard using onKeyDown, and we learned some more details about strings, as well as the window object, which represents the browser. Here are some exercises you can do on your own to practice using the DOM. In this lesson, we're going to add CSS to all of our projects, and we're going to finish our rock, paper, scissors project. CSS is a different language that changes the appearance of our website. It's one of the 3 languages that we use to create websites. So first, let's look at the projects we're going to work on in this lesson. We'll go to our browser and create a new tab at the top. And here, we're going to type super simple.dev/projects/dom-with-css and press enter. So these are the same 3 projects we created in the previous lesson, except this time we're going to add CSS to make these projects look nice. Let's start by creating a copy of the project's HTML file from the previous lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click this icon to show our files. And then here, we're going to select 09-dom-projects. We're going to right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And let's rename this file by right clicking, rename. At the end, we're going to remove copy. And at the beginning, we're going to change it to 10 and press enter. Now let's hide our files. And we're going to open 10 DOM projects in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. Now we can close our previous tabs, as well as the previous code from lesson 9, which is this file and these 2. And now we're ready to add CSS to our projects. We'll start with the YouTube subscribe button. Let's go to the tab for our project, and we're going to style this button first. So we reviewed CSS in lesson 4, and one of the ways we can write CSS code is using the style element. So inside the head section, we're going to create an element using less than, style, greater than. So the style element lets us write CSS code inside. So inside here, we're going to write button, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. So the code in front of the brackets is called the CSS selector. This tells the computer which elements we want to style or change the appearance. So button will style all button elements on the page. But in this situation, we only want to style the subscribe button, because the calculate button will be styled differently. So to style a specific element, we can use the class attribute. So if we look at our button, currently it already has a class of JS subscribe button, but this class is being used by our JavaScript. A good practice is to add a different class that would be used by CSS. So an element can have multiple classes. We just separate them with a space. So inside this class attribute, we're going to type space and add another class, subscribe-button. Now this element has 2 classes, and we're going to use this second class in our CSS. So to style a specific class, we're going to remove button, and we're going to type a dot. So starting with a dot means we're going to style a class rather than an element name. So we'll style the class subscribe-button, which is this button right here. And now inside these curly brackets, we're going to tell the computer how to style this button. For example, border, colon, none, and semicolon. If we save, this will remove the border from the button. So it no longer has a border like this button. So that's how we style a specific element with CSS. We add a class to the element, And then inside CSS, we start with a dot and the class. And between the curly brackets, the code on the left is called the property. This tells the computer what we want to change. On the right is called the value. This tells the computer what we want to change the property to. We separate the property and value with a colon, and we end the whole thing with a semicolon. So this is also called a property value pair. As a reminder, this is just a review of CSS. If you want to learn CSS in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. So we just added one style to this button. We're going to add more styles so that it looks like our final design. To make this easier, I'm going to rearrange my windows, and I'm going to put the final design at the bottom and then our project at the top. This will make it easier to compare the two designs. Next, to make it look like the final design, we're going to style our element one by one. Let's go back to our code and press enter. And next, let's change the background color to black. To do that, we'll type background dash color colon black and semicolon and save. Now our button has a black background. Let's keep going one by one. We'll change the text color to white next. So in our code, we'll type color colon white and semicolon and save. Now, if you're wondering how I know all these properties, you can usually find them by searching in Google. Just make sure you search for what you are trying to do. Let's keep going one by one. The next thing we'll change is we're going to add spacing on the inside of the button. In CSS, space on the inside of an element is called padding. So we'll create a new line, and we'll use the property padding dash top colon 10px and save. So this will add space on the inside of the element called padding at the top of 10px. So the px here means pixels. A pixel is a unit of measurement in computers. Your screen is made up of many small little squares. Each of these squares is called a pixel. So a pixel is the smallest thing that you can have on your screen. Screen sizes are measured in pixels. Images and video sizes are also measured in pixels. And don't worry, the more you work with pixels, the more you'll get used to how big a pixel is. So in this example, 10 pixels is equal to this amount of space, and it looks pretty close to the final design. So let's keep going. We'll add space on the inside of the element at the bottom this time. So we'll create a new line and type padding dash bottom colon 10px again and save. And that adds space at the bottom of the element of 10 pixels. Next, let's increase the space on the left and the right. We'll go into our code and add padding dash left colon 10 pixels and padding dash right colon 10 pixels. Let's save. And it added some extra space on the left and right, but I think our final design has a little more space on the left and right. So let's go back and increase our padding. So instead of 10, let's try 15 on both sides. So we'll save, and now the spacing looks close enough to the final design. So in CSS, it's normal to do some trial and error to get the styling right. Let's keep styling this one by one. Next, we'll make the text thicker or bold. So let's go into our code, and to change the thickness of the text, we'll use the property font dash weight colon bold. Let's save, and that will make our text bold. So we're almost there. Now let's make the corners rounded, like in the final design. We'll go back to our CSS, and the property for making the corners round is called border dash radius. And we'll make it 5 pixels. Let's save. And you can see that it made our corners round. So the pixels here tells the computer how round we want the corners to be. The higher the pixels, the more round it will get. So if we change this to 10 pixels and save, it will make the corners even more round. So let's change this to something really big to make it completely round. We'll change this to 50 pixels and save. And now our button is completely round. The last style we're going to add is in the final design. If we put our mouse over the button, it turns into this hand icon. So we call this a pointer. And we're going to do the same thing in our project. So let's go to our code. And to create that pointer icon, we're going to use the property cursor : pointer. And let's save and put our mouse over the button. And you'll notice it turns into this hand pointer icon. And that's it. Now our subscribe button looks like the final design. Next, let's click the subscribe button. You'll notice that it only changes the text. But if we click the final design, it also changes the background color and the text color. So we're going to learn how to change the CSS when we click a button. Let's go back to our code, and this time we're going to scroll down to our JavaScript, which is here. So we learned in the previous lesson, we can get HTML elements from the page and put them inside our JavaScript. And we also learned that these HTML elements are just JavaScript objects, and they can have properties like inner text and inner HTML. Every element has another property we can use called class list. Class list gives us control of the class attribute. So one solution we can do is when we click the button, we can add a class. And then this class will have different styles. So let's see how we do that in our code. We'll scroll down to the subscribe function. And when we click the button and make the button subscribed, we're also going to add a class. So let's create a new line, and we'll type button element dot class capital L list. So class list itself is an object, which means it has properties and methods we can use. One method is called .add, which adds a class to an element. So after this, let's type .add and brackets. And now inside these brackets, we're going to put a string. So this string is a class that we want to add when we click this button. Let's add a class called is-subscribed and save. So now every time we click this button, it will add a class to the button called is-subscribed. Let's give it a try. First, we'll right-click on the page and then click Inspect. And we'll go to the Elements tab. And I'll rearrange my windows so you can see it. And then inside the HTML, pay attention to the class of the button. Now when we click the button, it's going to add an extra class called is-subscribed. So that's what this line of code does. And now that this button has the is-subscribed class, we can style it in our CSS. So let's go back to our code, and we'll scroll up to our CSS. And here, we'll type dot to style a class, and we'll style the class is-subscribed. Is-subscribed. And curly brackets. And now inside these curly brackets, let's change the background color to gray and the text color to black. Background dash color colon gray and then color colon black. And make sure to type these styles below the subscribe button styles so that these styles will override the styles above. Now, if we save and then click our button, it will add the isSubscribed class. And now this button will get our new styles that we added here. So that's one way to change the CSS when we click a button. All right, now I'm going to move this back to the top. And notice that our background color is different from the final design. The final design uses a much lighter gray. So how do we get this exact color? To do that, we're going to open the Elements tab again. So on this page, we're going to right-click, click Inspect, and then click the Elements tab. And I'll rearrange my windows so we can see it. So in this section, in the Style section, we can see the CSS that the element has. So first, let's actually find this button, which is right here, and we'll click it. And here, it will show us the CSS that this button has. And it will show us the background color that we should use. So let's make a copy of this color and put it into our code. Right-click, copy, and here, we'll remove it and right-click and paste. Now let's save and go back to our project and try it out. And now we get the exact same color as the final design. So by the way, this color is known as an RGB value. RGB means red, green, and blue. And computers can create any color using a combination of red, green, and blue. So the first number here is how much red we want in our color. The second number is how much green we want. And the third number is how much blue we want. Each number goes from 0 to 255. 0 means less color and darker. 255 means more color and lighter. So this color here uses 240 for all of the colors. So it's close to 255 and will give us a very light gray color that you see here. Next, if we go back to the final design and we click our button again, it will change back to the original style. So we're going to create this feature in our project as well. So one way to do this is when we click the button again, we can remove this class. So let's scroll down to the bottom to the subscribe function. And when we click the button and we change it back to subscribe, we can remove this class. To do that, ClassList has another method we can use called remove. So let's create a new line and we'll type button element dot class capital L list dot remove and brackets. So this does the opposite of dot add. It will remove a class from this element. So inside the brackets, we'll type a string and the class we want to remove, which is subscribed, and save. Now let's try out our project. We'll click the button. It will get the class isSubscribed and get the extra styles. And now when we click the button again, it will remove the class and it will remove the extra styles. So notice here that when we add a class, we just type the class name. We don't type a dot and the class name like we did for query selector. Typing a dot only makes sense in query selector. Next, we're going to style the text on the page. Let's scroll up to our CSS And one thing we can do is to style all the paragraph elements on the page using this code, P and curly brackets. However, we're going to use a better solution. Instead of styling all the paragraphs, we're just going to style the body element. When we change the text in the body element, it will change the text in the entire page. So inside these curly brackets, let's change the text here. So we're going to use a different style of text. This is called a font. To change the font, we're going to use this property, font-family, colon, and we'll change it to Arial, which is what I used in the final design. So let's save, and this will style all the text inside the body and change the font to Arial. And a good practice is to write any styles for the body at the top. So if we need to, we can override it later. So let's move these to the top. We'll right click, cut, and then up here, create some new lines, and right click and paste. And we're going to add one more style before moving on. Let's add some space between the subscribe button and the second project. So earlier, we learned that space on the inside of an element is called padding. Space on the outside of an element is called margin. So inside our subscribe button, at the bottom, let's add a property called margin-bottom, colon, 30 pixels, and save. So this will add space on the outside of the element at the bottom of 30 pixels. Now let's move on and style the Amazon shipping calculator with CSS. Again, we'll add a class to these elements and then style them in our CSS. Let's scroll down to the text box, which is the input element, and we're going to add another class by typing space, and let's use the class cost-input. And now we're going to style this in CSS. So let's scroll up, and here we'll style the class using .cost-input and curly brackets. And inside, we'll style this one by one. Let's look at our final design and see what styles we need. So first, let's change the text size because our text is a little smaller than the text here. So to change the text size, we're going to use font-size, colon, and let's try 15 pixels and save. And now our text looks close enough to the final design. Next, let's add some space inside the text box. So remember, space inside an element is called padding. So we're going to type padding dash top of 10 pixels, padding dash bottom also 10 pixels, and let's add padding to the left 10 pixels and padding dash right of 10 pixels. So this will add a space on the inside of our text box in every direction. If we save, now it looks just like the final design. Now I'm going to show you a shortcut for padding that will save us some typing. So if we create a new line, we can actually use a property called padding and colon, and then type 10 pixels. This padding property lets us add padding on multiple sides at once. If we type one value here, like 10 pixels, it will add 10 pixels to every side. So this line does the same thing as these 4 lines above. So let's actually comment this out using /* and */ and save. And you can see that this one line of CSS did the same thing as the other 4 lines of CSS. So this shortcut can save us some typing. Next, let's move on and style the calculate button. Again, we'll add a class to this button so we can style it. So in this button, let's add a class attribute. Class equals calculate dash button. Now let's style this in our CSS by scrolling up. And here we'll type dot calculate dash button and curly brackets. And inside these curly brackets, we're going to style this button one by one. So let's start with the background color. So we'll type background dash color colon green and semicolon and save. Next, let's change the text color to white. So we'll type color colon white and save again. Okay, let's keep going and we'll remove the border around this button. So we'll type border colon none, save. Next, let's make our text a little bigger, like in the final design. So we'll type font dash size and make it 15 pixels and save. Okay, so now let's add the space on the inside of the button. So we're going to use this shortcut again. We'll type the padding property, colon, and this time we're going to give it 2 values separated by spaces, 10 pixels and maybe 50 pixels. So it's easier to see what this does. So when we give 2 values to padding, the first value is the vertical padding, so the top and bottom. The second value is the horizontal padding, or left and right. If we save, so you can see that the left and right has a lot of padding, which is 50 pixels. So now let's make this match our final design. So instead of 50 pixels, let's bring it down to 15 pixels and save. Okay, so that looks pretty close. Let's also increase the padding on the top and bottom so that the text box and the button line up with each other, like in the final project. So let's change the vertical padding to maybe 12 pixels and save. The last thing we'll style for this project is when we put our mouse over the button, it turns into the pointer icon. So to create this, we're going to use the property cursor colon pointer and save and give it a try. And that's it. We just finished styling the Amazon shipping calculator. So now let's give this a try. We'll type 25 in the text box and press calculate. And at the bottom, it will add $10 of shipping and show $35. Finally, we're going to style the last project in this lesson, which is the rock, paper, scissors project. And this will finish the project. Let's go back to supersimple.dev and we'll scroll down on this page and then click this link to show the final design for rock, paper, scissors. So I'll rearrange my windows so we can see this. And we're going to change the buttons to these nice big icons for each of the moves. And when we click a move, it will show the result in bold and show an icon of the move that we picked and the move that the computer picked. So we're going to make this project look really nice. Now let's get started. I'm going to rearrange my windows back so we have it at the bottom. And let's create a copy of the rock, paper, scissors project for this lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click here to show our files. And we're going to make a copy of 09-rock, paper, scissors. So let's click this file and then right click, copy, And down here, right click and paste. And we'll rename this file by right clicking, rename, and at the end, we'll remove copy, and at the beginning, we'll change it from 9 to 10 and press enter. Now let's click here to hide the files, and we can close the 09 file. And let's open the 10 rock, paper, scissors file in the browser. So we'll right click and then open with live server. And I'll move this tab to the top here so we can see it side by side. So let's start by styling the body. We want to make the background color of the entire page this dark gray color. We'll go into our code and let's create a style element so we can write some CSS. Inside the head, let's type less than style greater than, and then inside here, we're going to style the body. So we'll type body and curly brackets. Now inside here, we're going to change the background color. So background dash color colon, and we're going to get the color that we see here by right clicking, click inspect, and then go to the elements tab, and I'll rearrange it so we can see it. And then here, we'll find the body element and click it. And in this style section, we can find the background color that we need. So let's select this and right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste, and a semicolon at the end. Let's save, and I'll move this back to the corner. And now our project has the same background color as the final design. Next, let's make the text color white. So in our CSS, we'll use the color property and colon white and semicolon and save, and that will make our text white. Next, let's change the style or the font of this text. We'll type font dash family colon Arial, which is what the final design uses, and save. All right, now let's style these elements one by one to match the final design. We'll start with this paragraph at the top. So inside the paragraph element, let's add a class so we can style it in CSS. We'll add class equals, let's call this the title, and then in our CSS, we can style this class by starting with a dot and then title and curly brackets. So let's make our title really big, like the final design. We'll change the font dash size colon 30 pixels and save. So that looks close enough. Next, let's make the text bold. In our CSS, we'll use font dash weight colon bold and save. Now let's move on to styling the buttons. So first, we're going to need these images in our project, and I'll show you how to get them. We'll put our mouse over the rock image, and we'll right click, and we'll click Save Image. And now we're going to find the folder that contains all of our code. So for me, it's on the desktop, and it's this folder right here. So I'll double click this folder, and then leave the file name as the default, rock-emoji, and click Save. And now in our code editor, if we click here, we should be able to see the rock image. Let's do the same with the paper and scissors image. So we'll hover over it, right click, Save Image, and in the same folder that contains our code, we're going to save the paper image. And finally, right-click, Save Image, and we'll save the scissors image. All right, now that we have these images in our code editor, let's learn how to load them onto the page. So we can do this using an HTML element. So we'll go back to our HTML code, and we'll scroll down, and inside the button, we're going to add an image element. So let's type less than img and greater than. So this is the image HTML element. It loads an image onto the page. The image element doesn't require a closing tag. This is called a void element. Now to load an image, we're going to add an attribute to this element called src. So src stands for source. It tells the computer which file or image to load. So let's look in our project. For this button, we're going to load rock-emoji.png. Inside the source attribute, we'll type rock-emoji.png. So what this does is it will look for the file with this name beside the HTML file, and it finds it right here, and it will load it onto the page. If we save, now inside our button, it loaded the rock image. Right now, this image is too big, so let's use CSS to decrease the size of this image. We'll hide the files, and let's give a class attribute to the image element so we can style it. So we'll type class equals, and let's call this a move-icon. And I'm also just going to add some new lines to make the code a little easier to read. So we'll scroll up to the CSS, and we're going to style this class using .move-icon and curly brackets. And let's decrease the height of this image. We can use the property height, colon, and a pixel value, 50 pixels, and save. So this will make the height of this image 50 pixels, and it will also resize the width automatically so that the image keeps its shape. So this size looks pretty close to the final design, so we can move on. Another feature of the source attribute is that we can put our files into folders. So let's open the files by clicking here. And let's say that we want to organize all of our images into a folder. So we're going to create a folder by clicking this icon. And let's name this folder Images. And we're going to drag these images into this folder. And drag this in here and in here. Now, unfortunately, you can see that the image doesn't load anymore. And that's because if we look at our code, source tells the computer to look for this file beside this HTML file. And right now, there is no file called rock-emoji.png because we put it in a folder. So to tell the computer to look inside this folder, we're going to type the folder name at the start, which is images. And then we're going to type a slash to go into the images folder and then look for this file, which is right here. If we save, the computer is now able to find this image and load it onto the web page. So this feature is called file paths. We can tell the computer to look for a folder beside the HTML file, like images, and then use a slash to tell it to go into the folder and look for a file. Now let's use this code to load the other images onto our page. So for the paper image, we're going to go to this button, remove the text, and then create an image element less than img greater than. And we'll give it an attribute source equals, and we'll locate the image. It is in the images folder. So we'll type images and then slash to go into the folder, and we'll load the file paper-emoji.png. So paper-emoji.png and save. So our image is really big. Let's give it the same class that we gave the rock image. So we'll add a class equals move-icon and save. So these styles get applied to all elements with the class move-icon. So it applies to both of these elements. Now let's do the same thing for the scissors button. We'll remove the text and we'll replace it with an image element, and we'll give it the source attribute images slash scissors dash emoji dot png, and we'll also give this a class of move dash icon to resize the images like up here. Let's save, and now we have all the images that we need. Now let's make these buttons look like the final design. We'll scroll up and let's add a class to these buttons so we can style them with CSS. So we'll add class equals, and let's use move dash button. And for this button, we'll add the same class equals move dash button, as well as for the third button, class equals move dash button. Now let's scroll up to our CSS, and we're going to style this class using dot move dash button and curly brackets. So first, let's change the background color to match the background color of the page. So we'll use background dash color colon, and we'll use a special value called transparent. And this will make the button see-through. If we save, now these buttons are see-through. Next, let's add this white border to our buttons. So we'll use the border property, colon, and we're going to give it 3 values. The first value is our border width, or how thick the border is. Let's use 1 pixel for now. The second value is the border style, and we'll use solid because it's a solid border. Other values we can use here are dotted or dashed. And the third value is the border color. So we're going to use white. And semicolon at the end and save. And that will add a border. So let's make our border a little thicker like the final design. We'll change this first value, which is the border width, to 3 pixels and save. Okay, so that looks pretty close. Now let's change the size of our buttons. Usually we use the padding to add space on the inside of an element, but in this case, our images have different sizes. So we're going to use width and height to set an exact size. So in our CSS, we'll type width, colon, and let's make it 100 pixels, and height, and also 100 pixels, and save. So it looks like our final design is a little bigger than what we have here. So let's increase the width and the height. So let's try 120 pixels and save. All right, so that looks pretty close. Now let's make these buttons round. And the property for that is called border-radius, colon. And to know how much we need to make it round, we can set it to half of the width or the height. So we'll set it to 60 pixels and save. Okay, so it's coming along really well. And lastly, we're going to add some space between the buttons. So remember that space outside of an element is called margin. So let's add some margin on the right. So we'll type margin dash right colon and maybe 10 pixels and save. And finally, when we put our mouse over the button, it turns into a pointer. So the property for that is cursor colon pointer and save. And now our buttons match the final design. So let's keep moving and style the next part of the project, which is the result and the moves. If you don't see this here, you can just play the game and it'll give us a new result. So to make this easier to style, we're going to go into our code. We're going to find the result, which is here, and we're going to add some fake results like you win. Let's save. And now we have this result and we're going to style it. So let's give this a class of result. And then in our CSS, we're going to style the class dot result and curly brackets. So let's make the text bigger. We're going to use font dash size colon and maybe 25 pixels and save. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's make the text bold. So we'll use font dash weight colon bold and save. And finally, we're going to add extra spaces between this and the buttons. So we'll add margin dash top and maybe 50 pixels and save. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Now let's style the moves. And again, we'll scroll down and we're going to add some fake moves in here so it's easier to style. So we'll type U and then an image. So let's use the less than image and the source attribute. And let's just load the rock image and the scissors image for the computer. So to load the rock image, we'll look inside the images folder, / to go into the folder, and then rock-emoji.png. So rock-emoji.png and greater than. And we'll add another image, less than image source equals images / the scissors emoji, scissors dash emoji dot png and greater than, and finally the text computer. Let's save, and this will create some results, although the images are really big. So we can use the class move icon to resize them to be the same size as the buttons. So for both of these images, let's add the class move dash icon. And here as well, class equals move dash icon and save. And now our images look good. Next, let's style this score section. So the only thing we need here is to add spaces between these two. So in this score element, let's add a class of score, and we'll scroll up and style this element using dot score brackets, and let's add some margin at the top. So margin dash top colon 50 pixels and save. And let's compare it. And it looks like our final design has a little more spacing than this. So let's change this to 60 pixels and save. And that looks close enough. And finally, we'll style the reset score button. So let's go back to our HTML. We'll add a class to this button. So here, class equals reset dash score dash button. So at the top, we'll type dot reset dash score dash button, curly brackets, and we'll make the background color white. So background dash color colon white. And let's also remove the border from our button using border colon none. Let's save and see how it looks. And then let's increase the size of this text because the final design looks a little bigger. So we'll add font dash size colon 15 pixels and save. Now let's add some extra space on the inside of the button. So that's padding colon, and we'll give it 2 values. The first value is the vertical padding. Let's use 10 pixels. And the second value is the horizontal padding. So let's use 15 pixels and save. And it looks like our final project is a little shorter than our button. So let's change the vertical padding to maybe 8 and save. And the last step is to add the cursor pointer. So here, cursor colon pointer and save. And that's pretty much it. We finished styling our rock, paper, scissors project. So now I'm gonna rearrange my windows so we can see the entire design, and it looks really nice. The last step here is to remove these fake results and use JavaScript to insert these results instead. So let's scroll down and we'll remove this result. And let's actually copy this code because we want our JavaScript to generate this code. So we'll right click and copy. And let's scroll to the bottom to where we insert the moves onto the page, which is here. And instead of this text, we're going to right click and paste the code that we had before. And this time, instead of picking rock every time, we're going to substitute this with the player move. So we'll remove this. And because this is already a template string, we can insert a value directly inside using $ and curly brackets. And we'll insert the player move. Let's also insert the computer's move in here. So we'll remove this and insert a value using $ and curly brackets, and we'll insert computer move. And now that we're inserting this with JavaScript, we can scroll up and remove the fake result, which is here. So we can select it and delete it. Now let's save. And we're not going to have anything in our results. And when we click a move, it will show us the result and also show us the moves that we picked. And that's it. We finished the rock, paper, scissors project. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is how to organize our code into different files. So notice that right now, all of our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is in one HTML file. And this makes the code harder to read because the file is bigger and it mixes 3 different languages. To make our code more organized and easier to read, we're going to separate each language into its own file. So let's scroll down and we'll start by separating our JavaScript into its own file. We'll click here to show our files and then click this icon to create a new file. And we'll name this file 10-rock-paper-scissors.js. .js and press enter. So when we end a file with .js, it tells the computer that this file contains JavaScript code, not just text. Now let's go back to our HTML file, and we're going to move all of this code into the JavaScript file. So we'll select this code, and then we'll right-click and copy, and inside the JavaScript file, we'll right-click and paste. Now let's save, and we'll go back to the HTML file, and we can delete all this JavaScript code. And now we're just going to load our JavaScript file onto the web page. To do that, we can use an attribute of the script element called src, or source. So we'll make it equal, and this does the same thing as the image element. It tells the computer which file to load. If we type 10-rock-paper-scissors.js, this will look for a file called 10rockpaperscissors.js beside our HTML file, which is this file here, and it will run all the JavaScript inside this file. So it does the same thing as before, except now our JavaScript code is in its own file. And this makes our code cleaner because each file only contains one language, and each file also contains less code. Now let's go back to the HTML file and save. And you'll notice that our project works the same way as before. We just organized our code better. Another feature of the source attribute is that it also uses file paths. So we can put this JavaScript file in a folder and we'll be able to find it. For example, let's show our files and let's create a new folder by clicking this icon. And let's name this folder scripts. So this folder will contain all of our JS files. So we can drag this file into the folder. And now we can locate it using the source attribute by typing the folder name, which is scripts, and then a slash to go inside this folder and look for this file. And it will find it right here. If we save, everything works as normal. Another feature is we can use multiple script elements. This lets us split our JavaScript into multiple files and then load them all onto the page from top to bottom. Next, we're going to learn how to separate our CSS into its own file. Let's scroll up to our CSS. So we can do the same thing with CSS. So let's click the HTML file and let's create a new folder, and we'll call this folder styles and press enter. So this folder will contain all of our CSS code. Let's click the folder and we'll create a new file by clicking this icon, and let's name this file 10-rock-paper-scissors.css and press enter. So ending the file with .css means this file contains CSS code. And now we can go back to our HTML and move our CSS into its own file. So let's select all this code and then right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. And save this file. Now let's go back to our HTML and we can remove this code. And we'll learn how to load our CSS file onto our website. So we're not going to use the style element for this. We're going to use a different element called the link element. So we'll type less than, link, greater than. And the link element doesn't require a closing tag. This is another void element. So the link element uses two attributes. The first attribute is called REL. REL means relation. This tells a computer what type of file we're loading. So we're going to set this attribute to style sheet. This means we're loading a CSS file. And then we'll add a second attribute called href. So href tells a computer which file we want to load. So this also supports file paths. So we can type the styles folder. This will look for a folder beside the HTML called styles, which is this one right here. And then we'll type / to go inside the folder and look for this CSS file, which is 10-rock-paper-scissors.css. So this will load all the CSS inside this file and apply it to our page. So it does the same thing as before, except we separated each language into its own file. If we save, everything still works and all the styles get applied. And just like the script element, we can also use multiple link elements to load multiple CSS files. So that's how we separate our code into separate files using the script element and the link element. It makes our code a lot easier to read because each file contains one language and it contains less code. And that's the end of this lesson. As a final reminder, the CSS we learned in this lesson is just a review. If you want to learn CSS in more detail, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course in the video description. So in this lesson, we reviewed CSS and added CSS to all of our projects. We learned about the class list property, which lets us control the class attribute of an element. We finished our rock, paper, scissors project, and we learned how to organize our JavaScript and CSS code into separate files. Thanks for watching this course so far. If you want to support this channel, you can check out the premium version of my courses just like this one, where you can get a certificate of completion and a better learning platform. If you're interested in extra videos from me, more in-depth videos, and behind-the-scenes content, you can check out these links here. You can also support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing this video with others. Thanks again, and let's continue with the course. Here are some exercises to help you practice using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together. In this lesson, we're going to learn two more features of JavaScript called arrays and loops. And we're going to use these features to create this to-do list project. First, let's create a new file for this lesson. We'll go to our code editor and click up here to show our files. And this time, make sure you have one of these HTML files selected so we don't create the new file in one of these folders. So now we're going to click this icon to create a new file, and we're going to name this file 11-arrays-and-loops.html and press enter. Now let's copy the previous lesson into this file. So we'll click on 10 DOM projects and we'll type here and type Control A or Command A to select the code, and then right click, copy, and in here, right click and paste. Now let's hide our files and we'll prepare this file for this lesson. So we can scroll to the top and we'll change the title to arrays and loops. And let's remove all of the CSS. And we'll also remove the HTML, which is right here. And we'll remove all the JavaScript. Now let's save, and we'll open this file in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. And let's also open the console. So we'll right-click, click inspect, and click the console. And now we can close the previous tabs and the previous code for now, until we just have the lesson 11 file. Now we're ready to learn arrays. An array is another type of value in JavaScript, and it represents a list of other values. So let's do an example and create our first array. We'll go into the script element, and we're going to type open square bracket and closed square bracket. And inside the square brackets, we'll type a value, like the number 10. And then we'll type comma and another value, like the number 20, and then comma again, and a third value, like the number 30. So this is an array, and it represents a list of 3 numbers, 10, 20, and 30. Now, arrays themselves are also values, which means we can save them in a variable. So at the front, we can create a variable using const, and let's name it my array, and we'll make it equal to this array. And we'll add a semicolon at the end. So now we created a list of values, and we saved this list in this variable. Let's create a new line, and we'll console.log my array and save, and it will display the list of values in the console. So that's basically what an array is. It's a list of values. Now to get a specific value in an array, we can use square brackets. So let's create a new line, and we'll type my array and square brackets. Inside these brackets, we'll put a number like 0. This number represents the position in the array. So 0 means the first value. If we console.log this code and save, my array square bracket 0 gives us the first value, which is 10, and that's what's displayed in the console. Now, if we change this to 1, this will get us the second value in the array, which is 20. If we save, it displays 20. So this number represents the position in the array. 0 is the first value, 1 is the second value, 2 is the third value, and so on. We can also change a value in an array, also using square brackets. So let's create a new line, and we'll type my array square brackets, and let's say we want to change the first value. So we'll type 0 for the first value, and we just make it equal to something else, like 99. Now if we console.log my array again and save, you can see that this changed the first value to 99. So that's basically how arrays work. We can access a value inside an array, and we can also change a value inside an array. Now that we understand the basics of arrays, let's learn the syntax rules. To create an array, we start with an open square bracket and we end with a closed square bracket. Inside, we can put a list of values, and we separate each value with a comma. We can also write an array on multiple lines, like this. We just put the new lines after the comma. Now to get a value inside an array, we can use square brackets and a number, like 1. This number is called the index. It represents the position in the array that we want to get. So the first value is index 0, the second value is index 1, third value is index 2, and so on. Notice that the index starts as 0. This is called a zero-indexed array. Now, inside an array, we can put any type of value. For example, let's create a new line, and we'll create a new array using square brackets, and inside we can put the number 1 and then comma, and we can also put a string like hello and another comma, and we can put a Boolean value like true and another comma, and we can even put an object like curly brackets, name, colon, socks. Now, an array itself is also a value. That means we can save arrays in variables like this, or even save it in an array. For example, in this array, we can add an array inside, like 1, 2. Next, arrays have a weird behavior when we try to check the type of an array. So on a new line, let's type console.log type of, and then square brackets 1, 2, and save. This will tell us that an array is an object. And that's because an array is actually an object, but it's just a special type of object. If we want to check if something is specifically an array, we can use this code, capital A array dot is array, brackets. And inside the brackets, we'll put an array, like square brackets 1, 2. So this will check if this value is an array. If we console.log this result and save, it will display true. And finally, because arrays are just a type of object, they also have properties and methods we can use. So one useful property is called .length. So we'll type console.log my array.length. This will tell us how many values are in the array. So my array has 3 values. So if we save, it will display 3. Next, we'll learn a useful method of an array called .push. This adds a value to the end of the array. If we did my array.push 100, this will add 100 to the end of my array. If we console.log my array and save, you can see that 100 was added at the end. The last method we're going to learn for now is called .splice. This removes a value from an array. For example, my array.splice and brackets, and a splice takes 2 numbers. The first number is the index that we want to remove. So let's say we want to remove the first value, which is index 0. The second number we give to splice is the number of values we want to remove. If we give it 1, it will remove 1 value at index 0. If we give it 2, it will remove 2 values starting at index 0. So for now, let's just remove 1 value. And let's create a new line and console.log my array and save. You can see that splice removed the first value from the array, or index 0, which was 99. All right, now that we understand the basics of arrays and the syntax rules, let's do some practical examples. So I've prepared a project we can do for this lesson. We'll go to our browser, create a new tab at the top, and here we'll type super simple.dev/projects/arrays and press enter. So this page contains the to-do list project we're going to create in this lesson. So down here is the final version of the project. We can type a name for our to-do, like make dinner, give it a due date, and then click add, and it will add it to our list. We can add another to-do, like wash dishes, and then select a due date, and click add again, and it will add another to-do to our list. And each to-do also has a delete button, so we can delete it when we're finished the task. So this is the final version of the project. And these two up here are simpler versions of the project that we're going to use to work our way up. So let's start with the first project up here. We're going to open our console by right-clicking, click Inspect, and click the console. And the way this first project works is we can type a to-do in this text box, like make dinner. And when we click add, it will add the to-do to an array and display it in the console. If we type another to-do, like wash dishes, and click add, it will add it to the array and display it in the console. So let's create this project. We'll start by creating a file for this project. We'll go to our code editor and click up here to show our files, and click this icon to create a file, and we'll name this 11-to-do-list.html and press enter. Now let's copy the code from arraysandloops.html. So we'll click here, Control A or Command A, and then right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And let's close this for now. We'll scroll up and change the title to to-do list and remove all the JavaScript code. And this time, instead of writing all the JavaScript in here, let's actually put the JavaScript in a separate file, which we learned in the previous lesson. So we'll open our files again, and this time we'll go to our scripts folder. We'll click this JS file, and we'll click this icon to add a new file to this folder. And let's name it 11-to-do-list.js and press enter. Next, we're going to load this file into our HTML file. So let's open this. And in the script element, we can remove the spaces, and we're going to add an attribute called src equals, and we're going to load the JavaScript file that we just created, which is inside the scripts folder. So we'll type scripts and then a slash to go into this folder, and we'll load the file 11-to-do-list.js and save. So So now I'm going to drag this file down here so I can see both the HTML and JavaScript at the same time. Close this for now, and I can close the other code for now as well. And finally, let's open this in our browser. So we'll right click, open with Live Server. And let's also open the console on this page. Right click, click Inspect, and click the console. Now, one more thing I'm going to do for this video is I'll rearrange my windows so that we can have the final design at the bottom. Let's start by creating the HTML elements. Let's go to the body, and we'll actually create a paragraph element to start. Inside the paragraph, we'll put the text to-do list. Next, let's create the text box. So to create a text box, less than input greater than, and we'll add a placeholder to this text box. Placeholder equals to-do name. Finally, let's add this button. So on a new line, let's type less than button greater than, and inside the button, we'll have the text add. Now let's save, and this creates all the HTML elements that we need. Next, let's write our JavaScript. So first, we're going to create an array to store our to-dos. And then when we click the add button, we're going to get the text from the text box and add it to our array. And finally, we'll console.log the array. Now let's convert these steps into code. Let's create a new array first. Using const, let's name it to-do list, and we'll make it equal to square brackets. So this is an array with no values inside. We also call this an empty array. Next, when we click the button, let's get the value from the text box. So let's go to our button and add an onClick attribute. And then inside here, let's create a function for this. So down here, let's create a function. We'll name it add to do brackets and curly brackets. And then inside the onClick attribute, we're just going to call this function. Add to do and brackets. The next step is to get the text in the text box. We can do that using document.querySelector. So to use query selector, we're going to put a class on this input element. So we'll type the class attribute js-name-input, and then in here, document.querySelector, brackets and a string, and we'll type a dot to get a class, and we'll get this class, js-name-input. As a reminder, this gets an element with the class JSNameInput, which is this element, and puts it into our JavaScript. And now let's save this in a variable. So at the start, let's type const input element and make it equal to this result. So now we took this input and put it into our JavaScript. To get the text out, we're going to use a property of the input element called value. So down here, input element dot value. And let's save the value in the text box in a variable so we can use it later. At the front, const name, and we'll make it equal to whatever's in the text box. Before we continue, let's console.log the name to check if this is working. So let's save this JavaScript file, and let's also save this HTML file. We'll go to our browser, and I'll resize it so we can see the console. And now if we type something in the text box, like make dinner, and click add, it will get the text from the text box and then display it in the console. Okay, so it's looking good so far. The next step is to add this name to our to-do list. So we learned how to do this earlier. We can use a method called push. Push will add a value to the end of the array. So let's remove this for now. And at the bottom, we're going to type our array to-do list dot push brackets, and then between the brackets, we're going to add our name here. And now the last step is to console.log the entire array. Console.log to-do list, and save. Now let's give it a try. We'll type make dinner in the text box and click add. It will take this text, add it to the array, and then console.log the array. And now we have our to-do list. Let's add another to-do. We'll type wash dishes and click add. Again, it will get the text in the text box and then add it to the array. So now our array has two values, and then we display them in the console. So that's how we create this first version of the to-do list project. Now, one more feature we're going to create is if we add something to our to-do list and click add, it will reset the text box. To do that, let's go into our code and we'll create some new lines. And remember that the value property represents the text in the text box. So to change the text in the text box, we can simply change the value property. So we'll type input element dot value and change it to the empty string. So this will make the text in the text box become empty. If we save and now type something in the text box and click add, it will reset the text in the text box. Let's move on to the second version of the to-do list. So here, when we type something in the text box, like make dinner and click add, it will actually display it on the page. If we type something else, like wash dishes and click add, it will also add it to the page. So how do we take our array and display each value on the page? To do this, we're going to learn another feature of JavaScript called loops. Loops let us run some code over and over, like a loop. So let's go back to our 11 arrays and loops file, and we can close this JavaScript file for now, and we're going to learn loops. So first, let's comment out the previous code by typing /* and at the bottom */. Let's scroll down and we'll create our first loop. We'll start by creating a variable using the word let, and we'll name this variable I, and we'll make it equal to 1. Next, we're going to type the word while, and then brackets and curly brackets. And then inside these curly brackets, we're going to put some code that the computer will run over and over, just like a loop. Let's put the code console.log I. So this will display the variable I in the console over and over again. Now, obviously, we don't want to loop this forever. So how do we get this loop to stop? We can do that using the round brackets up here. Inside these round brackets, we're going to put some code that results in true or false. For example, we can check if I is less than or equal to 5. So the way this works is that if this code results in true, the loop will keep going over and over. Once this results in false, the loop will stop and it will go to the next line. Now you may notice that this code will never result in false because I is equal to 1 and 1 is always less than or equal to 5. So when does this actually become false and stop the loop? The answer is, inside this loop, we're also going to update this variable I. So we'll type I and we'll make it equal to itself plus 1. So now every time we loop over this code, we're going to increase I by 1. And eventually, I will be greater than 5. This will return false, and it will stop the loop. If we save, and then go back to the tab for this file, and I'll rearrange my windows so we can see the console, this loop makes the computer count from 1 to 5. So let's go over this code step by step to make sure we understand how it works. First, we create a variable I and we make it equal to 1. And then we do a loop. So if this condition is true, the computer will keep running this code over and over again. So the first time it loops, I equals 1, and then it displays 1 in the console, and then we increase I to 2. Now we go back to the top and we check this code. 2 is less than or equal to 5. This is true. So we're going to run this code again. This time I equals 2, and we display it in the console, and then we increase I to 3. And now 3 is still less than or equal to 5, so this is true, which means we keep running this code. And eventually, this is going to increase I to 6. Once I is 6, this will become false, which will cause the loop to stop, and then we go to the next line. So that's why it counts from 1 to 5, and then it stops at 5. So this is called a while loop. While this condition is true, it will keep running this code over and over again, just like a loop. As soon as this condition is false, it will stop the loop. All right, now that we understand how a while loop works, let's learn the syntax rules. To create a while loop, we type the word while, and then round brackets and curly brackets. The code inside the round brackets is called the loop condition. The code inside the curly brackets is called the loop body. The variable I at the top is called the loop variable. Every time we loop, we're going to increase the loop variable. This is known as the increment step. The increment step makes sure that the loop ends at some point. Without this increment step, the loop would just keep going forever. This is known as an infinite loop. Now remember that I equals I plus 1 has a shortcut. Instead of this, we can just do I plus equals 1. And remember, we actually have an even shorter shortcut for plus equals 1. Instead of this, we can also do I plus plus. So this will increase the value of I by 1 every time, just like before. So those are the three major parts of a loop: the loop variable, the loop condition, and the increment step. Now, each time we run this loop, this is called an iteration. So in this loop, we did 5 iterations. We ran this code 5 times. And lastly, loops create a scope. Any variable that we create between these curly brackets will only exist inside the curly brackets. So that's a while loop. While this condition is true, it will keep running this code over and over again. once this condition becomes false, it will stop the loop and go to the next line. So in JavaScript, there's actually two types of loops. The first type is a while loop, which we just learned. Now we're going to learn another type of loop called a for loop. To create a for loop, we'll create some new lines, and then down here, we'll type for, and brackets and curly brackets. Inside these brackets, we're going to type 3 pieces of code. The first piece of code is a loop variable, which is the same thing as this line up here. So we'll type let I equals 1, and then semicolon, space, and we'll type a second piece of code, which is the loop condition. So here, we'll type I less than equal to 5, and then semicolon and space. And the last piece of code is the increment step, which is this line right here. So we'll type I plus plus. And between these curly brackets, we'll write the code that we want to loop over and over. So let's just type the code console.log I and save. So this for loop does the same thing as the while loop above. It counts from 1 to 5. And if we look at this code, we can see that a for loop is just a shorter version of this while loop. Instead of writing the loop variable, condition, and increment step separately, we group all of them together at the top. So this loop works the same way. First, we create a loop variable, and then as long as this loop condition is true, we will keep running this code over and over. And every time we run this code, we're also going to increase the loop variable by 1. So now that we learned 2 ways of doing a loop, which one should we use? If we're doing a standard loop, for example, it has a loop variable, a condition, and an increment step every time, it's recommended to use a for loop because a for loop is shorter and more organized than a while loop. However, if it's a non-standard loop, then it might be better to use a while loop. So what's an example of a non-standard loop? So let's say we want to generate random numbers until we get a number that's at least 0.5. To create this loop, we'll create a variable that will store the random number using let random number and make it equal to 0 to start. And then we'll do a while loop, brackets and curly brackets. Now inside the loop condition, we want to keep running this loop until random number is at least 0.5. So we'll check if random number is less than 0.5. Because if it is less than 0.5, we want to keep running this loop until we get a random number that's at least 0.5. And then inside this loop, we're going to generate a random number between 0 and 1, and then save it in the variable up here. So we'll type random number and make it equal to capital M math.random. So if this random number is less than 0.5, it will keep generating random numbers until we get a number that is at least 0.5. So at the bottom, if we console.log random number and save, it will give us a random number that's at least 0.5. So notice that this is a non-standard loop. It doesn't really have a loop variable that we increase every time, and it also doesn't have the increment step. So in this situation, when we have a non-standard loop, it's better to use a while loop because they're a bit more flexible. All right, now that we learned the basics of loops, let's do some practical examples. we're going to learn a technique called looping through an array. This means we're going to go through each value of an array one by one and do something with each value. So first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and */. At the bottom, let's create an array of strings. So we'll create a variable const to-do list equal to an array. And inside this array, we'll have the string make dinner, another string wash dishes, and another string watch YouTube. Now let's take each value in this array and display it in the console. To do that, we're going to run a loop, and this loop is going to count from 0 to the last index in the array. So remember that the index is the position of a value in the array. The first value is index 0, the second value is index 1, third value is index 2, and so on. So below this, let's type for brackets and curly brackets. Inside these brackets, we're going to create the loop variable. So here, we're going to count the indexes. Let index equals 0, semicolon space, and we'll do the loop condition. So we'll keep looping as long as the index is less than or equal to the last index. So remember that the index starts from 0. This means that the last index in an array will be the number of values in the array minus 1, or the array.length minus 1. To-do list dot length minus 1. And here we'll add another semicolon, and we'll add the increment step, which is index plus plus. So we'll increase it by 1 every time. Now inside these curly brackets, we can do something for each index of this array. For now, let's just console.log this index and save. So this will count from 0 to 2, which is exactly all the indexes in this array. And now, using this index, we can also access the value at this index. So instead of just the index, here we can do to-do list and then square brackets, and between the brackets, index. This will take whatever the index variable is and access that index in the array. So if the index variable is 0, this will access to-do list index 0, which is the first value. When the index is 1, it will access to-do list index 1, which is the second value, and so on. So for now, let's save the value in a variable using const value and make it equal to-do list bracket index. And now let's console.log the value instead. If we save, this will loop through each index of the array, get the value at each index, and then display each value, which is what we see in the console. So this technique is called looping through an array. We use a loop to go through each value of an array, and then we can do something with each value. Now, I'm going to show you a few shortcuts we can use when looping through an array. Instead of checking if index is less than or equal to-do list.length minus 1, we can shorten this to index less than to-do list.length. So this check does the same thing as before. The loop will stop at index equals length minus 1, but it saves us some typing. Another shortcut is, instead of naming the loop variable index, we can shorten this to I. And we'll shorten this as well, and this as well. And that's why we often name the loop variable I. I means index. Next, we're going to learn a technique that we can combine with looping through an array called the accumulator pattern. So first, let's comment out the previous code using /* and */. And at the bottom, let's say we have an array of numbers like this. How do we calculate the total of all the numbers in the array? Let's set up this problem. Let's say we have an array of numbers, const nums equals array, and then the numbers 1, 1, and 3. And we want to calculate the total of all the numbers in this array. To calculate the total, we'll learn the accumulator pattern. The first step of the accumulator pattern is to create a variable to store the result. So below this, let's create a variable const total, and we'll make it equal to 0. And the next step is to loop through this array and update the result. So down here, for brackets and curly brackets, and inside the round brackets, we'll create the loop variable let I or index equals 0, semicolon space, and we'll create the loop condition I less than nums dot length, and then semicolon, and the increment step I plus plus. So as we learned earlier, this loop will go through each index of this array. And now between these curly brackets, first, let's use the index to get each value. So we'll type nums and then square brackets and access the index I. And let's save this in a variable using const num equals this value. And finally, we're going to add each number to the total. We can type total and make it equal to itself plus each number. And remember, we have a shortcut for this, which is plus equals. And finally, since we're changing this total variable, we have to change from const to let. All right, so after this loop, we should have added each number in the array to the total. So at the bottom, let's console.log the total and save, and it will display 5, which is the exact total of all the numbers in this array. So that's the accumulator pattern. We first create a variable to store the result, and then we loop through the array and update the result. So notice that as we loop through the array, we're adding or accumulating the results into this variable. And that's why this is called the accumulator pattern. And we call this variable the accumulator variable. All right, let's do another example using the accumulator pattern. Let's say we're given this array of numbers again, and we want to create a copy of the array where each number is doubled. So if the array is 1, 1, 3, we're going to create a new array with 2, 2, 6. So at the bottom, we'll create some new lines and use the accumulator pattern. The first step is to create a variable to store the result. Let's type const, and let's name this nums doubled. And we'll make it equal to an array this time. So notice in the previous example, the accumulator variable was a number. In this example, the accumulator variable is an array. So we can use different types of values to accumulate the result. It all depends on the problem we're trying to solve. So now the next step is to loop through this array and update the result. At the bottom, we'll create a for loop, brackets, and curly brackets. Inside the round brackets, we'll create the loop variable let I equals 0, and we'll create the loop condition I less than nums dot length, and then the increment step I plus plus. And now between the curly brackets, we're going to get the number at each index. So const num equals nums square bracket I, and then we're going to update the result. So down here, we're going to add this number doubled to this array. So remember, to add a value to an array, we can use the method push. So we'll type nums doubled dot push brackets, and we're going to add to this array the number num multiplied by 2. And now at the bottom, let's console.log the result, nums doubled, and save. So this second loop will create an array where each number is doubled. So that's how we solve this example. All right, now that we understand how to loop through an array and the accumulator pattern, let's go back and we'll create the second version of our to-do list. So when we add something to the list, it will appear on the page. Let's go to our code editor and we'll open 11todolist.html, and we're also going to open the JavaScript file. So it's this one, and for the video, I'm going to drag it to the bottom of my code editor so that I can see the files side by side. So I'll close this for now, and I'll rearrange my windows a bit. Let's open the tab for this project. So we'll review what we have so far. We can click in this text box and type a to-do like make dinner and click add, and it will add this to-do to this array, which is this array right here. We can type another to-do like wash dishes and click add, and it will add it to the end of the array. So now that we have this array of to-dos, we want to display it on the page. To do that, we're going to loop through this array, and we're going to create some HTML code for each to-do, and then put that code on the web page using the DOM. So first, let's loop through this array. To make this easier, let's make a copy of this array. So right-click, copy, and then here, we'll remove this and right-click and paste. So this will give us some default values to work with. So at the top, let's loop through this array using a for loop. So we'll type for brackets and curly brackets, and then inside the round brackets, we're going to create the loop variable let I or index equal 0, semicolon, and the loop condition I less than to-do list dot length, semicolon, and then the increment step I plus plus. So this will loop through each index of this array. And then inside the curly brackets, let's get the string for each index. So we'll create a variable to save it, const to-do, and we'll make it equal to do list, square brackets, and I. And now for each to-do, we're going to create some HTML code. So we'll create a new line and create a variable const HTML and make it equal, and we'll create some HTML code using this to-do, using a template string. And then inside, we'll create a paragraph element. So less than p greater than, and then less than /p greater than. Inside this paragraph, we're going to insert this to do. So we'll type dollar and curly brackets and to do. All right, so now we're looping through this array, and for each to do, we created some HTML code. And now we're going to combine all of this HTML code together and put it on the web page. To combine this HTML together, we're going to use the accumulator pattern. So at the top of the loop, we'll create a variable to store the result, let to-do list capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the empty string at the start. And then as we loop through the array, we're going to add this HTML to the variable up here. So let's create a new line, and we'll do to-do list capital HTML plus equals HTML to combine all of this HTML code together. So now after the loop, let's console.log to-do list HTML to see what we get. If we save, we took this array of strings, generated paragraph elements for each string, and then combined them all together. So now that we have all this HTML, we can put it on the page using the DOM. So first, let's create an element where we can put this HTML. So inside the HTML file, after the button, we're going to create a different type of element called a div element. So we'll type less than div greater than. So the div element represents a container. Its purpose is to contain other elements inside, like paragraphs, buttons, and even other divs. So in this situation, we can't actually use a paragraph element because in HTML, we cannot have a paragraph inside another paragraph. So that's why we have to use a div element here. For now, let's put some text inside this element so we can learn more about it. We'll type text and save. So like the paragraph element, the div element is a block element. That means it will take up an entire line by itself. And that's why it appears below the text box and the button. Now, one difference between a div and a paragraph is that a paragraph adds extra space above and below the paragraph, while a div does not add any extra space above or below. So it doesn't have any default styling. All right, so now that we learned the div, let's put this HTML code inside this div. First, we need to get this element into our JavaScript. And to do that, we'll add a class to this element, class equals js-to-do-list. And then down here, let's scroll down, and we'll put this div element inside our JavaScript. We can do that using document.querySelector, brackets and a string, and we'll type a dot to select a class, and we'll select the class js-to-do-list. So this will get this div element and put it inside our JavaScript. And then every HTML element has a property called .inner capital HTML, which controls the HTML inside this element. And now to put the to-do list HTML into this div element, we're going to make the inner HTML equal to the to-do list HTML. And now let's save this file and also save the HTML file. So this code will take the HTML that we created using the loop and put it into the div element. And that's how we make them show up on the page. So now let's try adding another to-do. We'll type watch YouTube and click add. And unfortunately, this new to-do doesn't show up on the page. And that's because when we click add, it will run this add to-do function and update the list. But we didn't actually update the HTML on the page. So to update the HTML, we need to run all this code again every time we add a to-do. So let's create a function for this code so we can reuse it. So at the top, we'll create a function, and let's name this render to-do list, brackets and curly brackets. So the word render means to display something on the page. So we'll put all of this code into this function. So we can delete this curly bracket, and then at the end, we'll type a closed curly bracket. And let's reformat this code by selecting these lines, and then press Tab to add an indent. So now let's use this function. At the start, we'll display this to-do list on the page. So we'll call this function by typing render to-do list and brackets. And then let's scroll down. Every time we add a to-do to the list, we're also going to display the list again. So at the bottom, render to-do list and brackets again. So if we save, at the start, it will display the list on the page. And then if we add to the list, like watch YouTube and click add, it will add it to the list and also display it on the page. So that's how we create the second version of the to-do list project. By the way, if we scroll up to the render to-do list function, this technique is called generating the HTML. Instead of writing all the HTML by hand up here, we looped through an array and we generated the HTML using JavaScript. So when creating websites with JavaScript, we usually follow a 3-step process. First, we save the data. In this case, we saved our data as an array. Next, we use the data to generate the HTML, which we did here. And finally, we make the website interactive, which we'll do later in this lesson. This is the main idea of JavaScript, and we follow this overall process when creating websites. The rock, paper, scissors project from the previous lessons was a bit different because all the HTML we needed was already there. We just had to modify it with JavaScript. So this process we're using for the to-do list is one step above what we did for rock, paper, scissors. We need to generate some HTML. And this is the standard process for creating websites. We're going to use this process for the to-do list and later the Amazon project, as well as websites that you build beyond this course. Let's take a break before continuing with the rest of this lesson. Here are some exercises that will help you practice what we learned so far. Now let's create the final version of the to-do list. We'll go back to supersimple.dev, and then here we'll scroll down and we'll create this final version. So in this version, we can type a to-do like make dinner, and we can also add a due date. And when we click add, each to-do will now have a name and a due date. And they will also have a delete button that we can click to remove it from the list. So let's build this out one feature at a time. We'll start by creating this delete button. We'll go into our code, and remember, we're generating the HTML for the to-do list. So for each value in the array, we create a paragraph element. So to add a delete button, we just have to add a delete button inside here. So inside the paragraph, we'll create a less than, button, greater than, and then less than / button greater than. And then inside this button, we'll put the text delete. Let's save. And in the console, you'll see that the HTML we generated now has a delete button inside the paragraph. And that's what shows up on the page. Next, we're going to reformat this HTML to make it a little easier to read. So we'll create some new lines here and at the end. And let's put the content of the paragraph on its own line, like this. And also put the delete button on its own line. So remember that template strings have a feature called multi-line strings. So this is perfect for writing HTML code. The last step in the process is to make the website interactive. So next, let's make our delete button do something when we click it. To do that, we use the onClick attribute as usual. So inside this button, we're going to add an onClick attribute equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we can run some JavaScript when we click this button. So this works the exact same way as what we've been doing so far in this course. The only difference now is that here we're generating this HTML using JavaScript. Okay, so when we click one of these delete buttons, we want to remove this to-do from the list. Earlier in this lesson, we learned how to remove a value from an array using a method called splice. So inside this onClick attribute, we're going to type the to-do list dot splice and brackets. So splice takes two numbers. The first number is the index that we want to remove. So if we click this delete button, how do we know which index to remove? Well, if we look at our loop up here, we already have the index. It's this variable I. So we're going to insert I into this string. And we can do that by typing dollar, curly brackets, and I. Now splice also takes another number. So we'll type comma, and the second number is how many values we want to remove. So here, we just want to remove one value at this index. And finally, because we updated the to-do list, we need to display the list again on the page. To display the list, we can use this function, render to-do list. So down here, we're going to type render to-do list and brackets. Now, if we save, you can see that in the generated HTML, when we click the first delete button, it will remove the value at index 0, which is the first value. If we click the second button, it will remove the value at index 1, which is the second value. So we're basically generating all this HTML using a loop. So now if we click this delete button, it will remove it from the list and then display the updated list on the page. So that's how we create the delete button. Next, let's go back to supersimple.dev, and we're going to create the due date feature. So first, let's create this date selector in our HTML. We'll go to our HTML file, and then under the text box, we're going to add another input element. So less than, input, greater than. And to make it a date selector, input elements have an attribute called type. So this attribute determines what kind of input it is. If the type is text, which is the default value, it's going to be a text box. Now, if we change the type to date and save, it's going to create a date selector. Now let's go back into our JavaScript code. And first, we're going to scroll up. And remember that right now, our to-do list is just an array of strings. But this time, each to-do is also going to have a due date. So how do we group the name and the due date together? We can do that using an object. So here, instead of just a string, we're going to create an object. And we'll give it a name property, which is make dinner, and we'll give it a due date property. And we'll make the due date a string. So you can type whatever date you have on the page. For me, it's 2022-12-22. And I'll end this object with a curly bracket, and I'll turn this second to do into an object as well. So open curly bracket, name, and due date. 2022-12-22, and closed curly bracket. Now that each to-do is an object, we need to update the rest of our code. Let's scroll down, and we'll start with the render function. So here, inside the loop, each to-do is no longer just a string, it's an object. So let's change this variable name to to-do object to make it more clear. And now we need to get the name and due date out of this object. So we'll type const name equals to-do object dot name and const due date equals to-do object dot due date. And now instead of inserting to do, which no longer exists, we're going to insert the name. And we're also going to insert the due date. If we save, now each to do will also display a due date. Before we continue, we're going to review a shortcut we can use with objects called destructuring. So here, you'll notice the variable name is the same as the property name. We actually have a shortcut for this using const curly brackets name equals to do object. So this is called destructuring. This takes the name property out of the object and puts it in a variable also called name. And this is a shortcut for this line up here. So we can comment out this line. We can also use multiple properties in this shortcut. To also take the due date out of the object, we can just add a comma and due date. So this will do the same thing as this line of code, and we can comment this out. If we save, everything still works. Next, let's scroll down, and we're going to update our add to do function. So this time, when we click the add button, we're going to get the name and the due date and put it into our list. So let's get the due date out of this date selector first. We can do that using the DOM like we did here. So let's add a class attribute so we can get it using query selector js-do-date-input. And then down here, let's create a variable const date input element and make it equal to document.query selector and a string dot, and then the class we want to select, which is this class, js-do-date-input. So this will get the date selector element and put it into our JavaScript. And now below this, let's get the due date out of the element. We can do that using the value property again. So let's create a variable first, const do date, and we'll make it equal to the date input element dot value. So this will get the date that we selected and save it in this variable. And now when we add a to-do to our list, instead of just a name, we're going to add an object. So open curly bracket, we'll add a name property, and the value will be the name variable up here. So name, and then comma, and a due date property. And the value will be this due date variable up here. So due date, and then a closed curly bracket. And remember that objects also have a shortcut for this. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type it out once, like this. This will do the same thing as this line above. Same thing with the second line. If the property and the variable name are the same, we can just type a comma and type it out once. This is called the shorthand property syntax. So these two lines do the same thing as these lines above. So we can comment this out using double slash and double slash. So that's all the code that we needed to update. Now let's save our JavaScript file, and we'll also save our HTML file. And let's go to our project. We'll add a new to-do like watch YouTube and select a date and click add and scroll down. You can see that it added our new to-do with a name, due date, and a delete button. If we click this delete button, it will remove that to-do. If we click this one, it will also remove the correct to-do. And that's actually all the functionality that we need for this project. So let's go into our code, and we're going to clean up by removing the console.log here and the console.log up here. And save. Finally, let's add CSS to our project to make it look like the final design. We'll go into our code editor and scroll to the top. And instead of writing all the CSS in here, let's put the CSS in a separate file, just like our JavaScript. So we'll click here to show our files, and then find the styles folder. And we'll click the styles folder and click this icon to create a new file inside. And we'll name this file 11-to-do-list.css and press enter. And for the video, I'm going to take this CSS file and put it at the bottom of my code editor so I can see these files side by side. And now I'll click here to close it, and we'll load this CSS into our HTML. To do that, we can use a link element. So inside the head section, let's type less than link greater than, and we're going to give it two attributes. Rel equals style sheet, and href equals the file that we want to load. So we created this in the styles folder. So we'll type styles and then a slash to go into the folder, and we'll load this file 11-to-do-list.css and save. Now let's style our project one by one until it matches the final design. We'll start with the text on the page. We're going to change the font. So in here, let's type body, curly brackets, and then we'll change the font dash family colon Arial and save. So that looks pretty good. Now let's work on styling the to-do list. First, let's add some more to-dos to the list. So we'll type watch YouTube, and then we'll select a date and click add. And we're going to learn how to style our list to look like this. So notice that this list creates a sort of grid. We're going to create this grid using a feature called CSS Grid. So let's go into our HTML first. We're going to add a class to this div element so we can style it. To-do-grid. And let's save. And inside our CSS, we're going to style this class using dot to-do-grid and curly brackets. And to turn this into a grid, we're going to use the property display and grid. And we're going to add another property called grid-template-columns. So this basically sets how many columns are in our grid. The number of values that we give it is the number of columns. For example, if we give it 200 pixels, 150 pixels, and 100 pixels, this will create 3 columns in the grid.